recording. My name is Andy Miller. I'm a professor here in the Department of Geography and Environmental Systems, and I'm in charge of running the department's seminar series. So I want to welcome everybody here today to hear a very special presentation by our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Fluri, who will be introduced by Grace Rigsby, who's a graduate student here in the department. Before we get to that, just a couple of bookkeeping points or logistics points. We are recording. We will post the recording after we get it back on the YouTube channel of the Center for Social Science Research. And we have set the controls so that people are muted on entry. The only people who can be unmuted at the moment are myself, but I will mute myself when Dr. Fluri begins speaking. Dr. Fluri, of course, will have the floor. We will ask people if they have questions to put those in the chat, and then we will call on you when we get to question and answer in the order in which your questions were posted. We typically end at 1. Sometimes we run over a little bit, depending on whether the speaker can stick around for a few more minutes. But if that's the case, and if it's okay with her, I can certainly keep going for a little bit longer than that. I think our last one ran about 5 or 10 minutes over. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we have invited to join us also 2 other UMBC folks. One is Zareen Taj, who I don't see on the call just yet. I'm hoping she will join us. Zareen is a PhD student in Language, Literacy, and Culture program, as well as working at the Shriver Center. But she's also herself from Afghanistan. She's a member of the Hazari minority. She's been an activist on behalf of women's rights and minority rights. She's actually currently working to try to bring a number of her own families over from Afghanistan. So for obvious reasons, this whole issue is very personal to Zareen. Dr. Ann Brodsky, who is chair of our psychology department, who may or may not make it. She just sent me an email a little while ago that she was detained and is hoping to make it. But she wrote a book back in 2003 about the revolutionary women of Afghanistan. So we were going to reserve some time when Dr. Fluri is done speaking for each of them to offer some perspectives on the situation of women in Afghanistan. So we hope for a very rich conversation. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask Grace to introduce Dr. Fluri.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. I'm Grace Rigsby. I am a master's student in the GES program, and I'm honored to introduce Dr. Jennifer L. Fluri. She is a professor and also the chair at the department in the Department of Geography at the University of Colorado Boulder. She's a political geographer interested in gender, geopolitics, international assistance, economic development, and peace building with a focus in Afghanistan. She has published over 30 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and her publications also include 3 co-authored and 1 co-edited book. Her current research project examines gender, security, and development in Afghanistan with a focus on Afghan women's leadership, and she is the co-editor of the Gender, Feminisms, and Geography book series at West Virginia University Press. And she serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Political Geography and the Journal of Cultural Geography. In Colorado, she also directs the Boulder Affordable Housing Research Initiative, a community-based service that provides access to affordable housing. So without further ado, Dr. Fluri, if you'd like to begin sharing your screen, you can go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to Grace for that lovely, very nice introduction. Thank you so much. And thank you, Andy Miller, for inviting me to speak today. And thank you, everyone, for being here. So today, my talk, as you can see the title here, Farce followed by Failure, the U.S. Saving Women Trope. So I'm basically going to spend the first part of the talk just giving you a little historical context and then an overview of why that is the title of my talk and U.S. International geopolitical and on-the-ground engagements in Afghanistan with a focus on the last 20 years. And then I'll end the talk by focusing on what's happening now and the work that myself and other academics that have been working in Afghanistan for quite some time now are doing to try and help our colleagues evacuate from the country who weren't evacuated in the initial U.S. evacuation that ended on August 31st. Okay, so the first thing is just a brief history of women's rights and activism in pre-war Afghanistan. So we could go back further, but I thought just to kind of set the stage a little bit, and I'm going to use these images just because these images have been floating around social media. These images have sort of resurfaced. They also surfaced a lot, not just these images, but similar images in the early intervention period when the U.S. was first invaded Afghanistan, which the 20th anniversary of that will be on October 7th of this year. And it was this kind of way of using these images to talk about, oh, this is how Afghanistan used to be. We want to help Afghanistan get back to this time period where women were walking around unveiled and they were going to school and doing certain things. So that's why I have these images up here. Now, these images are all from the capital city. The women that were basically part of the modernization efforts in Afghanistan in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. We're basically part of an urban intelligentsia, an urban and often elite group of women that had access to education and were part of this part of modernization efforts in Afghanistan. Also in the 1970s is when RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, which Anne Brodsky wrote a book about, which came out in 2003 called With All Our Strength. They were founded in the 1970s. They still exist today. And then a number of other women's organizations were founded at that time, many connected to the Communist Party that came into power in the late 70s. And others that were later formed in the 80s and 90s, some in refugee camps in Pakistan as well. So I'll get to that in a minute. But just to also give a brief overview of the kind of how we got to where we are today geopolitically and looking at that in relationship to gender. So in 1978, there was an internal coup by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which was a socialist and communist leaning organization, and that also had ties to the Soviet Union at that time. And then there was a lot of infighting within that group, and they basically were having a hard time maintaining control after the coup. And so some members of that organization connected with the Soviet Union, and they invaded the country in December of 1979, or aided the country, depending on what side of the politics you sit upon. And then from 79 to 89, the Soviet Union militarily occupied Afghanistan, and the U.S. supported a diverse group I would say a number of different groups known as the Mujahideen that were part of the resistance against the Soviet occupation. The U.S. originally supported them covertly and then more overtly. They also worked with Pakistan at that time through the ISI, or their version of the CIA, and were very much involved in supporting some of the most brutal and kind of fundamentalist organizations. In fact, at that time, the Reagan administration identified pan-Islamic jihadism as a method of fighting godless communism. So that was actually the thinking of the time as to why they were supporting these various groups. And they tended to support the ones that were more brutal and did not have a good human rights, and certainly not a strong women's rights network. In fact, some of the leaders of these organizations were known to have thrown acid on women who were attempting to go to school at Kabul University, just as an example of how not positive they were around women's rights or women's position in society, in public life. And so in 1989, the Soviet withdraws, but they continued to back the central government in Kabul. This withdrawal was negotiated between the UN, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and basically cut out the Soviet-backed government at the time, and which is similar to what happened during the Trump administration most recently, where they were negotiating with the Taliban in Qatar, but didn't include the central government that the US was backing in Afghanistan as part of those so-called peace talks. So in 91, the Soviet Union falls, as we know, and then that prompted the central government to basically have very little power because they weren't getting financial or military support from the Soviet Union. And then the Mujahideen groups, which were, as I said, disparate, they weren't necessarily coordinated or connected with each other. They began to fight with each other for control of Afghanistan, and particularly the capital city, Kabul. And so most of the destruction in Kabul actually occurred during the Civil War period, where they were basically using the city as the battleground for the Civil War. The Civil War occurred in other parts of the country as well, but definitely destroyed Kabul city. And then in 96, the Taliban take over. The Taliban, as you may or may not know, were formed in Pakistan. Mostly young men and boys were taken from refugee camps and provided military strategy. And also they were provided with education, which was mostly rote memorization of the Quran, not a terribly robust education. And then they began to make inroads into Afghanistan in 1994, and then took over the Kabul in 1996, and basically continued to have control over about 90% of the country. And then in 2001, as you all know, the events of September 11th prompted the US to lead an invasion with the so-called Coalition of the Willing of Afghanistan, and on October 7th. And then they, along with NATO forces and other coalition forces, militarily occupied the country until just recently. So from 2001 to 2021, they US-led foreign military occupation, and they also led, as the largest donor country, international aid and economic development interventions in Afghanistan, which I'll focus a bit on that today. And then we now know in August 15th, 2021, the Taliban take over Kabul. So that's just a brief overview. So part of what I want to talk about is the kind of farce of the US wanting to save Afghan women, because part of what the US rhetoric after they invaded Afghanistan on October 7th was followed by a lot of criticism of that invasion, and criticism of the way it was handled, of the US going back to these Mujahideen leaders who were basically warlords and were not considered to be good leaders in Afghanistan. And there was a lot of controversy about that. And so somewhat of the political discourse shifted to the US going in to save Afghan women. Because during the Taliban's rule, women were prevented from working outside the home. They were prevented from going to school. Women couldn't even see a male doctor. Women weren't allowed to be in public space without fully being covered in the burqa or the chadri, and having a mahram, or at that time, a male companion, a male family member. So it had to be a male that was someone in their family, husband, brother, father, son, grandson, as an escort, to escort them around, to be an accompanier, if you will. And so the idea that the US was going to go in to save Afghan women was, I would argue, somewhat of a farce, because it was an empty and patently ridiculous act, because it didn't really fit with what was actually happening on the ground in many ways. And there was an enormous lack of understanding of what gender roles and relations were in Afghanistan, and what existing women's rights organizations and women's activists like RAWA and other women's groups were actually doing, what they needed, what they thought was important for Afghanistan. So there wasn't a robust understanding of that either. And also, the US was supporting a lot of the Mujahideen who, as I mentioned before, were known to have been abusive to women, and using women as as kind of pawns in their geopolitical interest in taking over Afghanistan throughout the resistance during the 1980s, and certainly in the 1990s during the Civil War. So the idea of saving Afghan women was also farcical in that way, and also that the US were an early supporter of the Taliban and stopped supporting them later, based on a lot of pressure from various women's organizations and feminist organizations in the US that were very critical of the Taliban and their treatment of women. The other farce is that the Taliban also, when they first came into power, came under this kind of umbrella idea that they were saving Afghan women, There's a popular story that kind of carried them through Afghanistan as they were taking over, that was that they saved women who had been kidnapped and raped by a warlord, and they were basically there to restore the honor of Afghan women. So the Soviets also claimed to be, saving Afghan women and from their from patriarchy, from the ways in which Afghan hierarchical gender relations existed by providing education and providing them access to public space and that sort of thing. So this is a farce that many people have claimed. And the one thing none of them have done is actually ask Afghan women in a very robust way what they actually want, need, and what will work in their own communities and country, which is incredibly diverse. Like, what works in one place is not going to work in another. There's a definite geography, if you will, to understanding how gender roles and relationships operate in Afghanistan, what is and isn't possible, and what will work for articulating women's rights. And this image that you're seeing now is part of also how the what I refer to as the grand narrative of saving women, and this kind of trope about the U.S. saving women. And this is Representative Carolyn Maloney, a Democrat from New York, actually presenting on the House floor. This was in October, after the U.S. had invaded in October of 2001. She was basically advocating for women to be included as part of the U.S. military mission. And she was basically using the burqa as a prop on the House floor to advocate for Afghan women. So that was one way. And then Laura Bush really took up the mantle of the so-called Saving of Afghan Women effort. And this, she has this very infamous speech. She was the first lady to speak at the presidential radio address in the U.S. And her speech was all about saving Afghan women and actually identifying Afghanistan as not civilized by saying civilized people of the world care about Afghan women and we need to go in there and basically save them. And that was in November of 2001. So these very prominent men and women, in the U.S. government and connected to the government, in addition to a lot of media, were sort of beginning to push this idea of the saving of Afghan women, and that the U.S. was really necessary to assist Afghan women. And other things that were occurring at this time, and this is just as a reminder of what was happening. So in the 2002 National Geographic basically went to find the Afghan girl that was on the cover of their magazine in the 1980s. This burqa free poster was one of the freedom poster competitions at the time. The Miss Earth pageant had a woman, Afghan woman, participate as Miss Afghanistan, even though she lived in California, and competed in the Miss America International pageant. Also won World Magazine. And they weren't the only ones, but you saw this kind of fetishization of the burqa or the veil, which was used as a way of in some ways calling attention to Afghanistan, and also sexualizing of the veil, which is antithetical to how it's used certainly in the country. And then in 2010, the cover of Time magazine had Biba Aisha, who was a woman who had run away from home and was brutally, her ears and nose were cut off by her husband, and she was brutally abused. And this I always thought was interesting. They were saying, what happens if we leave Afghanistan, which is what we're here to talk about today, even though we were in Afghanistan when these certain things happened. And then this other image on the bottom of the screen is the Beauty Without Borders, or the Beauty School of Kabul, which was a project that was actually a very small project that occurred, that was amplified to being this huge thing. And there was a best-selling book written about it and a documentary made about that as well. And a movie was optional, though it's, to my knowledge, has never been made. So this is just to set up this kind of frenzy about women in Afghanistan and helping women in Afghanistan. And the issue for those of us who were studying Afghanistan at this time is that it was a farce in many ways, because what we saw happening is that women, or like the assistance of women, or focusing on Afghan women, really turned women almost into a currency. So this idea that organizations that we were working with or we were interviewing about their aid and development work in Afghanistan were often adding women in as a line item in order to make themselves more available to larger grants, rather than actually doing programs to help Afghan women. So that was one issue. Another were organizations, basically donor driven, coming in saying we're going to do these projects for Afghan women, but then again, not necessarily listening to or really providing funding, a robust funding, I would say, to the local Afghan-run non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations. Certainly, some of them do and have been funded, and they really do run off of international donors. But the amount of funding they were getting compared to the international organizations was really fractional. And so what we also saw happening in the 2000s and early 2000 teens was this kind of internal brain drain happening between these organizations, where you saw women working for local Afghan-run non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations, and then they would get some, basically get skills that they needed to do office-type jobs, and then they would basically leave those jobs and go work for international organizations, and really, and sometimes double or quadruple the salary, depending on the organization. And I have this image here also to remind us that a lot of the high profile women that were able to be evacuated from Afghanistan, which are, women in these images with Hillary Clinton and Laura Bush, are and it's important, and I'm very happy that they were able to be evacuated, because they are incredibly high profile and their lives are absolutely under threat at this time. But what I also want to talk about is the women who are still in Afghanistan, who are so in some ways the employees, or women that are working on grassroots activism that didn't really register with these big international projects because they were small scale, they were working within communities, and they weren't really connected to some of the larger organizations that were mostly based in Kabul city and the capital, where you saw women's activism happening in various parts of the country, and many of them having difficulty now. They're under threat but unable to get out of the country because they didn't make it in that first, or really only, wave of evacuations in August. A number of these high profile women are also very interested in still doing activism, right? So they're in the US, or they're in a third country for their own protection, but are still advocating for women's rights in Afghanistan. And so what we're starting to do now is kind of switch the research, because my research has really been focused on Afghan women's leadership over the last few years. And that included conducting interviews with many of the women you see in these images, but also interviewing women that are working on improving women's life at the village scale, at the community scale. So women that are midwives and teachers, or are part of prominent families in certain communities, in addition to women who have been working as part of the international aid and development effort. Also, men are in Afghanistan, many men are very supportive of women's rights and are advocates for women's rights. And this image here on the bottom right, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but these were men who wore burqas and were basically advocating for women's rights. And this was outside of the Independent Human Rights Commission in Afghanistan. And this image here of Farhunda, this is a woman who was actually brutally beaten to death in Afghanistan. Whoops, sorry. I'm so sorry. Beaten to death in Afghanistan for falsely being accused of burning the Quran. And she was actually a Muslim, Islamic student. Was a devout Muslim. And that event actually galvanized tremendous amount of protests, not just in Kabul city where she was murdered, but throughout the country. And it was protests that were organized by women's local NGOs, Afghan-run non-governmental women's organizations and civil society organizations, and a lot of men participated in that as well. And so that just kind of sets the stage up from where we are, and some of the frustration that we've heard from a number of women is what I'm calling misunderstanding and missed opportunities. And this is mainly again, the not listening, the lack of understanding of gender roles and relation and how they differ by community. And a lot of this also has to do with the fact that internationals often saw women or gender, mainly they said gender, but they meant women every time they said gender. And they also saw women as a single and unique category of analysis and didn't address, for example, the ethnic diversity among women. I mean, Afghanistan's an incredibly ethnically diverse country. It also has linguistic diversity. And so that diversity is experienced by both men and women. Women don't live separate from men in Afghanistan. Women and men are, live in households together. They live, work, play together, right? And so separating women out as a separate category is in many ways a false way or a flawed way of understanding or being able to articulate how to improve women's rights and changing gender roles in Afghanistan. So, and I always say, and I say this to my students all the time, like if you don't understand how gender is constructed, socially constructed, how it works within a particular community, how can you provide suggestions or put together projects and programs to improve women's lives when you don't actually understand the context within which they're operating? And so this leads to, like, one of the things that I always try to remind people of is there is an incredible ideological diversity. So you have ethnic diversity, you have geographic diversity, you have linguistic diversity, you have religious diversity, mostly between Sunni and Shia. Most Afghans are Muslims, not all, but the vast majority, and the majority of Muslims in Afghanistan are Sunni, but there is a Shia minority as well. And you also have diversity of education levels, type of education, the curriculum, the type of access people have to not only to education, but to different modes of thought, different belief systems. People's access to the internet is incredibly diverse in Afghanistan. So you have all that incredible diversity. So expecting women to all think alike about what women in Afghanistan need is completely ridiculous. And I just use these three kind of interlapping Venn diagrams because these are very broad categories, and these are broad ideologic categories for women's groups in Afghanistan. So you have groups that tend to go along the more Islamic feminist route, so using Islam as a method for articulating women's rights in Afghanistan, to have women's organizations that are really kind of focused on that. You also have organizations that tend to be more leftist or socialist leaning. Not to say that these are organizations that are still connected to the Communist Party or the communist sympathizers of the 1980s, but they tend to be more kind of leftist in their approach to women's rights. And then you have the more capitalist, or I would say the ones that are really been heavily influenced by US-led international interventions and US programming, either through USAID or other implementing partners that really took a very liberal feminist approach. And by that, I mean this idea of having women work outside the home will improve their standing within their communities, increasing women's participation in politics, increasing women's public participation. And that doesn't mean that Islamic feminists and socialists or left-leaning feminists don't also want those things, but their methodological approach is often very different. So the overlapping parts of all of these is although there are definite ideologic differences, many women's organizations do agree on stopping violence against women, eliminating. In fact, there was a law on the books in Afghanistan called the Elimination of Violence Against Women law, which was basically set up to try to deal with the enormous challenge of addressing domestic violence in Afghanistan and other forms of violence or harassment of women in Afghanistan. So while all three of these groups would agree that that is a worthy cause and something that they should actively work towards, they very much disagree on the methodology for doing that, like how to do that methodologically, meaning what are the methods for addressing or improving women's rights in Afghanistan, ensuring that women aren't abused, that gender-based violence is eradicated in the country. And so the ways in which they would go about that were really quite different, which women's organizations would often get critiqued for. But I would argue that that was absolutely necessary, because in a conservative community, in a rural area, they're going to rely on their local leaders and the mullah or imam in their community to be a guide for articulating women's roles in society, right? At that level of the leadership. And so women having influence through Islam was really, really important in those communities. And in many ways, they had to work with imams and mullahs as proxies, because unfortunately, women aren't always seen as able to speak with authority on Islam, even if they're incredibly well educated, and sometimes more educated than the mullahs or the imams about Islam in certain communities. So in many ways, the Islamic feminists really worked with mullahs and imams as partners in identifying and addressing women's rights within Islam, which really helped to push back against some customary practices that very much disadvantage women, but are also considered haram or forbidden in Islam. And so Islam worked very effectively in those cases. And then on the sort of more liberal feminist side, the successes they had tended to be in more urban areas, and areas where women had more access to education, there was more economic opportunity and that sort of thing. And then social and leftist organizations really saw the ways in which they articulated women's rights were in some ways advocating for secularism, not that they were anti-Islam, but because they saw politics as perverting Islam, and in order to preserve it, they wanted to take a more secularist approach and a more communal approach, like seeing women like trying to get women to work together across ethnic groups, across these kind of divisions and diversities that I'd mentioned before, and kind of dealing with those challenges as well. And so understanding that not only are there all, as I said before, all this kind of diversity of ethnicity, belief, access, geographic location, but there's also this ideologic diversity, which I think is something that should be celebrated and understood rather than critiqued and putting everyone into this kind of more capitalist box. And that's really was driven by Western ideas and kind of Western feminist, liberal feminist ideas on what should occur in the country, which in many ways was where we get to the failure, and the definition of failure I'm using here is a falling short. So this doesn't mean that every project was a failure, that everything that happened, didn't work out very well, because many women did get access to education that they hadn't had before. Many women did get access to employment that they didn't have before. There was incredible job skills trainings programs for women in many parts of the country that had varying degrees of success. As I mentioned, a number of the Islamic feminist approaches had success in certain parts of the country as well. So the falling short is really when we compare the amount of money that was spent in Afghanistan versus what actually was able to occur. And I've done research on this, as many others have, and including the Special Investigator General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, John Sopko, wrote a number of reports about the inability to identify particularly USAID programs and whether or not they were actually effective at helping women in Afghanistan beyond the kind of urban elites that had access to USAID and their implementing partners, and to the grants and programs that they were funding. And so this is part of what I and my co-author Rachel Lair, who herself also ran an NGO in Afghanistan, a very small scale one that was really focused on providing job skills training and income for women in one part of rural Afghanistan. And so our book is called The Carpetbaggers of Kabul, because we looked at the ways in which people were also incredibly profiting on the war. And this is something that we're not hearing enough about in the news right now, is, so much of the blame is being put on the Afghanistan government and the ineffectiveness of their leaders, particularly Ghani and others in the government, and the tremendous amount of corruption that was in the government. But we're not hearing about is the international corruption that was a huge part of this as well, and how many internationals and some Afghan elites made a tremendous amount of money and really profited at all scales, like low-level profiteering by just making enormous salaries and basically capitalizing on, as I mentioned, women being this kind of currency by saying you're supporting Afghan women, even if you actually aren't implementing any programs to do that, or selling products that were made by Afghan women and using that as a selling technique and that sort of thing. And so we really investigated what we were calling this kind of carpetbagger thing. And the term carpetbagger, for those who aren't familiar, really comes from the US Civil War, when the post-Civil War period, when Northerners would go to the South and basically profit on the destruction and the reconstruction money that was coming into the South for their own personal gain, rather than it going to actual building. And so we saw that happening in Kabul. And this image, Yankee Go Home, is actually, we took this photograph off of a new building. It was and I thought it was interesting, it was also in English, because that was the mantra in the Civil War, post-Civil War era in the US, Yankee Go Home being talking about the Northerners. And it has become kind of an international saying about wanting the US out of a country. And the other interesting thing about this image is when we first took the image, it was a completely new building. And then when we had to have the image retaken for the book cover. And by that time, it was only a year later, as you can see, the building is really quite literally crumbling. And that's another issue that came up a lot in our research, is how many buildings and projects that were put into place really crumbled very quickly after they were built or instituted, because there wasn't enough fund. There was so much subcontracting of funds that they basically, by the time the road, building, whatever was being constructed, there was precious little funds for materials and labor. And then for the women's programming, there was precious little funding to actually be implemented after everyone took their cut. And some of our interviews also showed like women being showed how to basically cook the books, and like how to pay, say you're paying someone, this amount of money, but actually paying them much less. And so this was very much part of the international corruption, as I would call it. But of course, not all the international workers were bad. A lot of them really were there to do a good job. But when we were looking at these massive macro scale projects, we definitely see a huge falling short, and not necessarily doing what they said they would do for Afghan women. However, and the latest, and these images I'll go over in just a second, but this latest failure would be, I say, the failures of the US engagements in Afghanistan go back to the Bush administration and every subsequent administration, Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, really botching the evacuation. The Trump administration, though, really takes the cake, if you will, for legitimizing the Taliban as a potential legitimate power in Afghanistan. And as I mentioned before, engaging in peace talks with the Taliban in Qatar. Although some women were involved in those peace talks, the central government was not involved. They were not invited to those peace talks. So basically cutting out the government that the US has basically put in place and has been supporting really since the early intervention period, from the interim government in 2002 to Karzai's government in 2004, and then now the Ghani government that has fallen. And so these images, I just want to go over really quick. So this image here is Afghans trying to get through the land border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. This was sent to us by one of the people who were actually trying to help get out of Afghanistan, who didn't make it in the first of the evacuation in August. This is just an image of Kabul city. As you can see, there there has been a tremendous amount of construction of the city, and it has really developed into a rather functioning city, although there's still a lot of infrastructure issues and problems that the city has to deal with that the Taliban is now inheriting, even though it was completely destroyed when they were in power in the 1990s. And then these images are just from an organization known as Art Lords, because Afghanistan, really throughout the 20 years of US-led interventions and other international interventions in Afghanistan, really became a walled city where you just had huge barricades and walls to protect certain buildings, mostly embassies, government offices, the American University of Afghanistan, those kind of things. And so this organization was started called Art Lords that was basically painting murals. These are huge murals on these massive buildings. And these have now all been painted over by the Taliban, and they are now repainting them with their slogans. So just to give you a sense of how the urban geography of Kabul city is really starting to be radically changed by the Taliban, in addition to a radical political change. And these are just some shadow images that a photographer took, and well, first of all, I think they're quite beautiful, and also I can't show images of any of the people we're working with for their own security, but this is how many of them have described how they feel, that they are being left behind, that they're just a shadow of their former selves, so that their hopes and dreams, with all the flawed politics and all the flawed approaches. Many of the people that I've worked with, either they worked with me as research assistants, or I worked with them trying to learn more about the organizations and the type of activist work that women were doing in the country. Many of these people, in fact, almost all of the people that we've been trying to evacuate are still stuck in Afghanistan, and many of young girls and women are very concerned about what their future will be, because the Taliban has said that women can no longer go to Kabul University, and the high schools have not been reopened. What will happen to healthcare? I mean, most of these people have lost their jobs because they worked with internationals. And as much as they did see it as a flawed international intervention, they also did believe in some ways in the dream that America had presented to them, right? That things would get better over time, that the country would be connected to the global economy, to the global political structure, that Afghanistan, that there would be hope for the country, and there would be hope for women in the country to participate politically, economically, socially, in ways that they hadn't in the past during the Taliban era. And so to have those dreams squashed has been incredibly, as you can imagine, depressing and difficult for women and men in Afghanistan, because many of the people we worked with were also men who also wanted to believe in this promise for a new Afghanistan, who wanted to be connected to the international community, who are savvy or educated, who speak multiple languages, who want to have this want to understand and be part of their country that isn't an isolated country that is beset upon by very fundamentalist and extremist Islam, but is a country that is very much a Muslim country, but one that really envisions themselves as connected and having opportunities for both men and women. And that's another, just to close with, the other thing the Taliban said relatively recently was that they would allow women to continue to participate in public life as long as it's under the umbrella of Sharia law or Islamic law. And I would say that's what has been happening over the last 20 years. It's a Muslim country. It has been the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan until just recently. And all the women's programming, whether they were in that Islamic feminist framework or not, we're still doing things within an Islamic framework, right? Under the only programs that ever really worked were ones that really fit within people's existing belief structures, right? So fit within an understanding of women's roles in Islam and an understanding of Islam that was much more progressive and open-minded than the Taliban, but it was still under that umbrella of Islam. For example, highlighting verses of the Quran, such as men and women are equal before the eyes of God, as a way of opening the discussion about women's rights. So I'll close there. I'm happy to talk also more in the Q&A about some of the efforts that we're doing to assist people in Afghanistan that are part of my research team. So the one hopeful thing we are working with now is I have an open National Science Foundation grant, and we were given permission. The National Science Foundation was given permission by the Department of State for me to provide names for refugee resettlement. Unfortunately, only 2 of them were able to get out of the country as part of the August evacuation, but we are currently working on steps to help individuals get to a 3rd country, because the US won't start processing their refugee paperwork until they're out of Afghanistan. However, many of them don't have passports or travel documents, so it's going to be quite a long process, but I'm happy to answer any questions about that as well. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Dr. Fluri. This has really been, it's fascinating. It's disturbing. We want to take an opportunity before we go to open Q&A to invite Zareen Taj to give us her perspectives. For those of us at UMBC who are aware of her work, she's a PhD student in the Language Literacy and Culture program here. She also works at the Shriver Center, and she herself has been an activist on behalf of women and minority rights. Zareen, I think I'm going to place you to the center. Let's see if this works. Okay, there you are. So
Okay.
please speak, please.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank you, Dr. Fluri, for all the detail and in-depth information about my country, particularly about the situation of Afghanistan, and especially these past 20 years. So I would like to mention I belong to a minority ethnic group in Afghanistan. I did my research. I went to Afghanistan in 2004 as a woman, but when I come back, I came as a Hazara, and now since that I'm involved in my country and through research, through advocacy works, and with dual identity, being woman and a Hazara, and also my position within insider, within outsider situations. So I have a different, I would like to share with the audience today my different takes of situation of Afghanistan, and especially now. This, as Dr. Fluri mentioned, with all this failure policies, and also like how we use women as a victims in Afghanistan to be rescued, and how all this are a failure, not correct representations of women, and also doesn't help women to get stronger in the situation. But despite of all the failures we have discussed in the US media and academic researchers are discussing, despite of all the failure in Afghanistan, these past, based to my advocacy work and my research, and also have from perspective on the oppressed ethnic group, I would like to question the generalization and misrepresentation of Afghan women, which the Afghan women, as Dr. Fluri said, do not fall in one categories of a gender-based issues. So there's a lot of issue which people are not addressing, their intersectionality of their multiple oppression. So despite of all the failures, I would like to say these past 20 years, the minority in Afghan, and also particularly my ethnic Hazara women particularly, have progress and had a lot of achievement. And all Afghan women, they had achievements which the history of Afghanistan never experienced, like as the first Ministry of Women, as a first woman rights commissioner, as a mayor, as a governors. All these are provided hope for generation, and particularly my research and my advocacy work is more focused in rural area women, not urban and dominant ethnic activists, which they are falling those categories, as Dr. Fluri mentioned, leftist, Islamic feminism, or capitalist. So these women I research, they are not falling any category. Their work are more based community approach, and more they are secular, because Afghan women, as myself, become activists in age of 14. We are tired of leftists, and we were tired of Islamic extremists. So we don't fall any of these categories. Of course, these 20 years, there was not any rule for Afghan political women organization to play a role, such as RAWA never played such a role because there is limitation for them. But despite of all this failure, despite of all this limitation, these Afghan women created a role model, which are my generation, a generation who grew up in war, and a generation who came back to Afghanistan to work after displacement during Russia and also during Taliban extremists. So these women, they women of a special rural area, they play a greater role and become a strong leader for their community, and they become a bread earner for their families and their communities. So all these helpless situation right now cannot help Afghan women because those skills they learn from to survive and cope with techniques, with situation, to provide food for their family, and now they cannot help and they cannot do anything in Afghanistan because everything is banned for Afghan women. So my intent is that the involvement of Afghan women and also an international community in Afghanistan help all Afghan women to bring a change in Afghanistan and open a space for Afghan women to have a participation in every step of life. So all these success story of Afghan women never being fully reported in the international community. So of course the US has failed to bring all those impact and more stronger change in Afghanistan, but this partial peace in Afghanistan helped a woman to bring to break all the traditional rules which was assigned for Afghan women and enter in political spheres and also be a bread earner for their family. So I would like to say the US withdrawal lead the empowerment of extremists in Afghanistan and instability to entire regions. So the decision of Biden administration to fully withdraw from Afghanistan, it was costly, particularly for minority and for Afghan women in general. So what we have right now just left Afghan women to struggle with survivals, and also especially those women activists and leaders, they are living in the rural area, they work for empowerment of their community, and they are bread earner for their family. They're left behind. Those women, they evacuated in Afghanistan, they all belong to dominant ethnic groups, and they have connection internationally, they are recognized, and they were able to, like, I know a lot of women in rural area, in central part of Afghanistan, in north part of Afghanistan, none of them left Afghanistan because there's nobody to help them.
Right.
So that is, I mean, right now, who are more in a danger? Minority, like my ethnic group Hazaras, they are in danger because of being women, because of being Hazara. They cannot hide this face. Like when I went to Afghanistan, I thought I'm a woman, I just cover my head, that will be enough. No, because I should cover my face because I'm a Hazara. They will kill me because, not because of being woman or activist, they will kill me because I'm Hazara. So all my those friends, they are right now in Kabul, in Herat and Mazar, they are leading protests and demonstration in Afghanistan. They are in danger right now, but nobody are helping them to do. And I just had a friend talk yesterday. She led a protest in Kabul. She was brutally beaten by Taliban and she is in a house arrest. She cannot leave Afghanistan. Even she attempted to go to Pakistan. So I think everything these 20 years have changed. The world has changed. We have changed. And even Taliban have changed because their techniques, their brutality is getting worse and brutal and more. What is have not changed? The West perception, presentation of women in Afghanistan. We are 20 years, 1996, we had, like as Dr. Fluri showed, that Sharbat Gul, the National Geographic they went to and found her in 90s during the Russia war. What you saw just the face of her as a victim, and then he went to back and found her in 2017. Just had a name, nothing else. She grew up in that camp, and she went back to Afghanistan. She helped her children to go to school where will be able to have a better life than her had during the war in a camp. No media is reporting about her, what kind of resilience, what kind of agency she played in the life of and herself and life of our children's. So what I'm more asking for those researcher expert to bring more awareness about situations of Afghanistan, because Afghan women are more in danger than used to be in 2000 in 2090, 96 or 98, because they are out, they are playing role in a society, and they are more in dangers and they need more help, and the hope is gone, but the resilience, the agency, and also the power is there, and they are using what they have a power right now. They're using their camera to record the oppression and the violence and brutality of Taliban. And they are on the ground, they are fighting, and they need helps. And
Yeah,
I would like
thank you.
to take question if
Thanks for sharing all that with us. I'm going to ask if people have questions they want to ask, please post them in the chat and we'll ask you to unmute and ask your question. Okay, so here's the first one. Emma, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you both so much for presenting today. Dr. Fluri, you mentioned the challenges with accessing passports and accessing paperwork for refugees, and I was wondering what exact next steps are involved in that and what sort of support is most beneficial to that effort.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your question. And first, Zareen, thank you so much. I absolutely agree with everything you said, and and I'm sorry I didn't get it to that in my talk, but like ethnic minorities are a huge issue, and I agree with you. There were a lot of positive things, and women are in Afghanistan are incredibly resilient and did a ton of work, and those are the ones that aren't being recognized enough, and that's what we need to be doing. And totally agree with you there. But as far as the getting passports. So right now the passport office in Afghanistan is still closed. There is some talk of it being opened, but they only have so many passports available to be issued. So how we'll be able to get, whether or not we'll be able to get people passports remains to be seen. So we're mainly looking into working with the consulate offices in Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan to see if we can get them travel documents so that they would be able to go to some of the refugee resettlement areas that the UNHCR is negotiating right now. It's not clear how those negotiations are going. I'm not clear on what the negotiations are, but with those countries so that they can be resettled in a third country, because it will take about a year to 14 months for their refugee status paperwork. And just to give you a brief overview on that, so there's the special immigrant visa, which is for Afghans who worked on US military bases or with the embassy. And then there's priority 1 or P1 and then priority 2 visas. And the people I'm working with are all priority 2 because they're not high profile. They didn't work on US bases. They're P2 because they worked with Americans, but like Americans like myself who are interested in actually understanding Afghanistan rather than those that are, we're there to just have people come and work in the embassy. I'm not trying to be too, critical there, but that's why we're having these issues and because they're priority 2, they're lower priority, and they also are people that tend to not have passports, right? That didn't think that it's expensive to get a passport and didn't think that they would need them. However, we're in the process of working on getting them some kind of travel documents, because the Taliban are not letting anyone leave without perfect paperwork. So not only having your passport, but also a visa, and to get on chartered flights that are going eventually to the US, they have to have this SIV or the special immigrant visa paperwork. So we're in kind of a little bit of a catch-22 right now, trying to get people the paperwork they need to get out.
Thank you. We have another question from Valerie.
Hi, yes. Hi, yes. Thank you, Serene and Dr. Flurry, so much for your time and sharing your thoughts and findings. My question is, as university students, and this is more personally as a non-expert in Afghanistan geopolitics, how can we support Afghani women without further contributing to the savior trope of the West?
Well, I would say, I mean, the way to support it is to listen to Afghan women. There's a number of Afghan women that are in the US um, going to talks like these, telling your friends about it, calling your congressmen and congresspersons and senators, and advocating for more funds to be provided for women in Afghanistan, both that won't be able to leave the country ever, and those trying to be evacuated or being resettled in the US. I would also say, like, most of these many of the Afghan women activists, some have social media profiles, like going right to the source and asking them what they need rather than, you know, listening to, I hate to say it, but like mainstream media or some of the government discourse about Afghanistan, because they're definitely not providing, I would say, accurate or truthful information about what the situation is on the ground. So, and I'd be happy to provide information about organizations that you could support. And it doesn't necessarily have to be financial support if you don't have those means, but helping to get the word out, or just offering moral support in some ways. Because you have to realize, I mean, and Zorina's right, Afghans are incredibly resilient people, but they've been under war for over 40 years now. And many people suffer with PTSD and all kinds of issues, plus this latest trauma of having their country overtaken again by the Taliban, which is an incredibly brutal and misogynistic government. So those kind of things I think are important. And Zorine, I'll defer to you.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, I would like also to add that Valerie, I will be able to connect you a lot of Afghan women leaders who left Afghanistan and they are in a camp like right now, and they are about to leave the camp and they need helps in the US. And also I know a lot of people, they are in neighboring country, in Pakistan, in India, in Tajikistan. Right now they need help with applications to fill, and they need also financial support. If any organization are helping, so there is a lot of people, and I will be able to connect you with especially refugee resettlement base or some organization. They are currently helping them to bring them out from the camp and military camp which they were settled there, and some of them are already resettled, a couple in Baltimore area and also in Virginia area. So I will be able to connect you with them.
So we will take one more question in a moment, but I'll ask the two of you, since you both have my email address, you want to forward that information, then I can make sure that we make it available to anybody who participated and who wants to spread it. So just send me an email and we'll post it after, when we get the recording back, we'll post it we'll post the information along with the recording. I'm going to ask Lucas to ask his question, if he's still here.
Hello. Thank you for all the information. And from what I understand, it sounds like there was a lot of disconnect between stated U.S. policy and actual U.S. action in Afghanistan for a variety of issues and topics. But as an outsider, I was just curious, what exactly, were there any, from a historical perspective, were there any militant groups in Afghanistan that nominally supported female empowerment, or was it, I know that's what the central government was in essence trying to do, but prior to its formation, was there any of that there from a militant perspective?
Do you mean like Islamic militants, or
Militant, like, well, I guess from like the different factions that would try to claim support, like the Mujahid, I can't pronounce the word.
Mujahideen.
There we go.
Yeah, I mean, women were involved in some of the resistance factions, not the ones necessarily supported by the US, which tended to be very extremist on the Islamic side and on the military side, but there were women involved in various types of resistance. So those groups that the US supported in the 80s and that then fought each other during the Civil War were not all the only groups that were resisting Soviet occupation. So there were other groups, some were more democratic leaning, some had different types of ideologies. And then there were definitely women, like that Zareen was mentioning, in rural areas that were just resisting, to protect their own communities from Soviet encroachment. So I wouldn't say it was those militant groups weren't well known to have women working within them as much, but there were women that were part of other forms of resistance.
I just want to add, yeah, during the Russia war, and especially during even Civil War, and the women who had the rule and resistance part, and especially in rural area, most of these U.S. called warlord, and which belong to minority ethnic group, because of having rules and influence in the rural and community area, so they allow women to have a space to help them in resistance. So that kind of opportunity, even it was not a very democratic way, but that kind of space or that kind of opportunity for women in rural area help them to shape a social movement and also civic engagement. So that help women to find a platforms to fight and resist all the time against violence or brutality. So that was a great opportunity for Afghan women to get involved that time.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, in the refugee camps in Pakistan in the late 80s and 90s, a number of Afghan women's organizations that still exist today were founded then because women were together in ways that they hadn't been before because they were in this camp situation. And so like the Afghan Women's Network and other Afghan like education organizations and women's advocacy groups were many of them were founded then and still exist today.
And I'm one of them. So I left Afghanistan when I was 7 years old during Russia time. So I grew up in refugee camp in Pakistan. So I became activist in the age of 14 in a camp because that was an opportunity for women, and women are strong. That time was a political organization for Afghan women, which they were playing a greater role inside the refugee camp. But unfortunately, after fall of Taliban and involvement of international community, there was not a lot of great chance for political organization or ideological based organization of women to play a role in Afghanistan.
Thank you.
Really
That was
thank
informative.
I want to thank Dr. Fluri, and I want to thank Zareen very much for bringing this program to us. It's incredibly important. It's an issue about which I would say most of us are not that well informed, and so this is an important contribution. We will be posting this on the YouTube channel of the UMBC Center for Social Science Scholarship, so you can let people know who missed this seminar that there will be other opportunities to view it. I will together, once I have the information that both of our speakers here have to provide access to information about organizations for support, we will make that information available as well. And just before we close out, I want to mention to those of you who are here at UMBC, we have another seminar coming up next week with our own Dr. Matt Fagan. His topic is the forests we need, the forests we create, restoring a degraded planet with ugly maps and space lasers. So I thank both of you again. We're going to stop the recording right now, and we're going to thank everyone who attended. And please look for the recording on the website of the on the YouTube channel. We will post the link to that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.